Welcome to episode 113 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by true crime FBI cases. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Herbert Cousins Jr., who served in the FBI for nearly 22 years. He retired as the special agent in charge of the Springfield Division in Illinois. In this episode, he reviews his investigation of self-proclaimed Black Messiah and cult leader Hulon Mitchell Jr., also known as Yahweh Ben Yahweh, who led the Florida-based Nation of Yahweh. The Nation of Yahweh was a cult founded on the religious teachings of Black separatism and supremacy. And on the instructions of Yahweh Ben Yahweh, members of the cult's violent inner circle committed numerous murders of cult defectors and random racial killings of whites. Yahweh and several of his followers were charged and convicted under the Racketeering Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, with predicate violations of murder, attempted murder, arson, and extortion. During his bureau career, Herb Cousins specialized in counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and criminal and security matters. After retiring from the FBI, he served for a period of time as the Inspector General of the Miami-Dade County Public Schools, the fourth largest school district in the United States. Currently, Herb Cousins is the owner of Cousins and Associates, an agency that provides private corporate security consulting, investigation, and litigation support on a national and international level. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. As a matter of fact, I forgot to mention during the interview that this case was featured on an episode of the TV series FBI Files. I made sure to put a link to that show in this episode's show notes. But before we get to the interview, I want you to know that I did purchase former director James Comey's book, A Higher Loyalty. I plan to read it this weekend and write a post about it for my May email to my reader team. My April email to my reader team featured a post I wrote about meeting current FBI Director Christopher Wray. I try my best not to talk about politics on this podcast, but if you're interested in hearing what I thought about James Comey's book, I invite you, if you're not already, to become a member of my reader team, where once a month I email a digest of the previous month's podcast episodes, my crime fiction recommendations, and I keep you up to date on the FBI in books, TV, and movies. To join my reader team, all you need to do is go to my website, jerrywilliams.com, and sign up when you see the pop-up. When you join my reader team, you'll get the FBI Reading Resource, which is a list of books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been featured on this podcast. There are approximately 35 books on the Reading Resource, including my FBI crime thriller, Pay to Play. I don't do Patreon, nor do I place ads on this podcast. But if you're interested in supporting the show, in addition to joining my reader team, you can do so by picking up a copy of Pay to Play for yourself or for someone you know who loves crime fiction. One last thing, don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast app. Thank you. Now here's the show.
I am excited to introduce my guest, Herbert Cousins. Hey, Herb, how are you today?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
Great. I am absolutely thrilled that you let me call you and so that we can talk about this case because I find it fascinating. It's a combination of murder mystery, domestic terrorism, Black supremacy. It's just so much involved to the point where I understand that you are in the process of writing a book about it.
Yes, that's correct. I'm actually looking forward to completing a book to include my involvement in the Yahweh case and some of the intricate details as to an investigator's commitment to getting the job done, despite the potential danger.
Well, that's definitely something for us all to look forward to. So we're going to talk about the Yahweh Temple and Yahweh Ben Yahweh, the leader of, I guess it was deemed a cult. Why don't you start? Why don't you tell us what you thought about the Yahwehs and whether or not it was a cult or not, and take us from the beginning.
Yes, the Yahweh was a group of individuals. The group was started by a man by the name of Hulon Mitchell. His nickname was Yahweh Ben Yahweh, God, Son of God. He started the Yahwehs by recruiting black citizens throughout the country, and he would bring them down to his headquarters known as the Temple of Love in Miami, in the Liberty City area. 22nd Street and 27th Avenue, they owned an entire block of property where they had what they call their Temple of Love. Individuals were recruited again from throughout the country. They gave up all their possessions, turned it over to Yahwehs. Some even sold homes and just traveled down to Miami and became Yahweh members. Yahweh Ben Yahweh, as a way to control these individuals once they came into join the temple, was to change their names. Their last names were always Israel, but the first name he gave them biblical name. For instance, Job, Israel, and others. Once the individuals were indoctrinated, they were 100% dedicated to their leader, Yahweh Ben Yahweh. But in addition to the people that he recruited, there was a group within the group known as the Death Angels. And those individuals he was able to use and instruct to commit serious crimes, to include murder. We know they committed at least 14 murders. They were charged with 14 murders in the indictment. In addition to murder, they were charged with arson and extortion. The arson involved the firebombing of an entire block of homes in Delray Beach, Florida. This individual was a charismatic leader who, when he spoke, some of the followers were just in a cult-like manner loyal to him, to the extent that they would go out and commit murder. I was assigned the case, the Yahweh case, in 1985. At that time, the case was being investigated as a domestic terrorism case. The definition of domestic terrorism: two people or more engaged in criminal activities to further their political or social goals. So this fit the definition to a letter. We had a lot of difficulties getting information regarding the criminal activities. Obviously, the individuals involved were not talking, and the ones who left the group were afraid that they will be retaliated against if they talk. As a matter of fact, one of the followers, a guy by the name of Ashton Green, decided he was going to leave the group, and he made it known to the leader at the temple. And the leader ordered the followers to beat him up, basically, and they took him out to the Everglades, decapitated him. They cut his head off. The Miami Police Department had been investigating a number of cases, and they were alerted by a witness who found the body out in the Everglades. They conducted an investigation. They found a set of keys on the victim, and they took those keys and they went to the address and did not find anyone. But they subsequently were able to speak to the roommate and his wife, The roommate's name was Carlton Carey and his wife, Mildred Banks. Well, they reluctantly spoke to the authorities, the Miami Police Department. When they returned home, the police department wanted to escort them back to their homes, and they refused to get that assistance because they did not want the people at the temple to know that they were talking to the police. When they returned home, they were ambushed. Hulon Carey was shot and killed, and Mildred Banks, who was also shot, an attempt was made to cut her head off. She sustained serious injuries, was taken to the hospital, and she survived. And of course, she cooperated as best she could with the authorities.
What is the message of the Temple of Love? What was Yahweh Ben Yahweh preaching to his followers?
He was preaching that the followers were the lost tribe of Israel and that they were the true Hebrew Israelites.
There's no criminality to the message itself. You talk about people being murdered, but prior to that, you had already been investigating them as a domestic terrorist group. So what brought the FBI into the case?
Well, when you have two people or more individuals engaged in criminal activities, and at the time we suspected that they were engaged in criminal activities to further their social or political goal, that is a typical example of a group engaged in domestic terrorism. They would terrorize the communities. They would purchase properties in the community. And for instance, the situation that occurred in Opelika, where they purchased an apartment complex and began to evict the tenants at the apartment. And of course, there was some resistance from a number of the tenants because they did not want to move. So two individuals, Anthony Brown and Rudy Broussard, who were tenants at the Opelika apartments, were subsequently murdered. Anthony Brown was seen on TV, quote unquote, blaspheming Yahweh because he simply spoke up and said he wasn't moving. And I don't remember the exact quote, but he was referring to the fact that nobody was going to move him from his apartment unless they had eviction notice. And there was some profanity said, if I recall correctly. That is what our sources told us, that was seen as blaspheming the leader, and therefore he ordered their murders. As a result, the police department arrested one of the followers, who was a former football player, Robert Rozier. And Robert Rozier was subsequently charged with the murders and was subsequently excommunicated from the group. As a result, he ended up cooperating with law enforcement. And myself and one of the detectives from Metro-Dade interviewed him for hours and hours, many, many days. He provided information regarding some of the murders. Some of the murders included the victims whose ear was cut off and returned allegedly to the leader as proof that they carried out the murder based on his instructions.
What were the particular violations that brought the FBI into the case? I'm not clear on that.
Again, the FBI was involved in the case. We opened the case based on domestic terrorism. The indictment indicated that the group was charged with murder, attempted murder, arson, and extortion through RICO prosecution. Now keep in mind that the group started in Miami. Their headquarters was out of Miami, but they had temples or locations in 13 other cities throughout the United States. And that's another reason why we meaning the FBI, became involved in the case. And we worked the case jointly with the police department based on the fact that the police was also investigating the murders that occurred within Dade County. In addition to that, in 1986, a number of homes were firebombed in Delray Beach, Florida. And we were able to determine that the Yahwehs were involved in those firebombings as well. A group of Yahweh members were in the Delray Beach area delivering literatures and selling some of their products. And some of the people in the neighborhood did not want them in their neighborhood, and they chased them out of the neighborhood. And some of the individuals who were chased out of the neighborhood called the temple and reported it to Yahweh Ben Yahweh. And Yahweh Ben Yahweh instructed his death angels to go back to the area and firebomb the homes, which resulted in the injury of several individuals, including a 9-month-old baby. The group, as you can see, was a very vicious group who retaliated against individuals if they crossed them in any way, and also retaliated against members who tried to either leave or cooperated with law enforcement.
Now, I've done a number of episodes on domestic terrorism, including shows about the Ku Klux Klan and the Aryan Nation. This is a little different because from the articles that I've read and the FBI file show that I watched, this group was considered a black supremacist group who spewed hate speech. Could we talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Some of the murders were white individuals who were, quote unquote, sacrificed for Yahweh.
Now, you're going to have to explain that.
Yahweh Ben Yahweh, based on testimony, instructed some of his death angels to go out and kill a quote-unquote white devil and return with one of their ears in order to prove that they followed his instructions. And so several of the 14 murders included white individuals that were randomly targeted by these death angels.
Now, you were saying that this group had a large following throughout the country. Were they aware of this message when they joined the Yahweh Temple? Did they understand that this was a religious cult based on hate?
No, they did not. And that's one of the reasons why I was so motivated to diligently work this case, because I felt that some of the majority of the individuals who believed in the message that Yahweh Ben Yahweh publicly gave believed that he was a loving individual who wanted to liberate black people so that they could live in areas clean of crime and so forth. So the outside image was that he was a nice person who believed he was God, but he wanted to do the right thing, clear out bad areas of drug dealers, clean up apartment complexes, and so forth. They amassed quite a bit of wealth because they owned hotels, they owned apartment complexes similar to the one in Opelika. In fact, October 7th of 1990, the mayor at the time declared Yahweh Ben Yahweh Day and gave Yahweh the keys of the city. In addition to all the criminal activities going on, the public image was that of a person who was trying to do good for the community, and obviously the politicians, I shouldn't say the politicians, this particular mayor rewarded him for what he thought was the good things that Yahweh Ben Yahweh was doing in the community. But in his defense, in the mayor's defense, they did not have the information that the FBI, that I had with regard to criminal activities or that the local police department suspected was going on with regard to criminal activities. He had a clean image with the public, and then the group within the group committing the murders and so forth were not known to, including some of the followers. And he exercised complete control over the followers, to include punishing Robert Rozier and debriefing Rozier. Those many, many days and hours, we learned quite a bit regarding the inner working of the group.
So he had two sides there was a message that related to this temple of love where he wanted to make the lives of African Americans in low-income areas better by building real estate and creating communities. And that's the message that everybody received. But inside the cult, he had a more sinister message. And I guess when people heard that message, those were the people who wanted to leave and were risking their life in trying to break away from the group.
That's absolutely correct. We developed a number of sources that provided information regarding some of the illegal activities and the suspected activities. And in fact, some of the individuals that we developed as sources confess to participating in some of the illegal activities.
Such as?
Well, the murder of Ashton Green, for instance, the individual that they beat up at the temple and took out to the Everglades and beheaded. There were several individuals involved in that situation based on the instructions that they were given. But despite the fact that they were involved, they knew that it was wrong at some point, and so they were able to assist law enforcement with providing the information that they had regarding the specific incidents of illegal activity, murder.
Can we talk a little bit about the partnership that you had with the local police department, with the Miami-Dade, because they were actively involved in murder investigations at the same time as you were leading the FBI's domestic terrorism investigation?
Yes, the concept here is not an unusual one. It's similar to what we call a task force type situation where law enforcement get together and, based on information developed, we share information. Obviously, the local police department were interested in the murders, but we were also interested in the murders and the interstate aspect of the group, the domestic terrorism component of this group. The idea is that the more we can determine and uncover regarding the group, the sooner we can bring them to justice. And so not only did we work with the local police department, but we also seek the assistance of other agencies and also, of course, the United States Attorney's Office, who ultimately would be the people who would bring about the prosecution of the case. I tell you, it was not an easy situation because an easy case, even the Justice Department in Washington, we tried our best to convince them the issues involved in the case to the point where we wanted to bring indictments, but when you're dealing with a group that claim to be a religion, then you get some complications with regard to religious rights and all the other issues. I tell you this as a case agent because that was the most frustrating thing for me, knowing what I knew and seeing Hulon Mitchell, Yahweh Ben Yahweh, give out this public image that was no way, no how, the reality of what was going on within the group. Knowing as the case agent of the group and what was going on within the group involving criminal activities was not reflective of their public image, or at least the image that Mitchell wanted the people to believe. And so that became a frustrating, it didn't make for a smooth investigative process. And that became pretty frustrating at times. But nevertheless, I persisted because I knew it was the right thing to do. I remember working some days 15, 16 hours per day, sometimes 7 days a week. But I just had to do what it took because I knew it was the right thing to do. And that's why I signed up to be an FBI agent.
Now, I would imagine that you got a lot of pushback in the community because if you're saying that Yahweh Ben Yahweh had this public image of doing good work in the African American community. They don't know about all of this hidden murder and threats and extortion. They're not aware of that, but they see this African American FBI agent who is going after this group that appears to be doing good work. Tell me about that dynamic.
Yeah, that's interesting because there were some in the community that felt that way, that they were a peaceful group and that, you know, they didn't deserve to be investigated and so forth. But there were some in the community that were afraid of them. For instance, the people in Delray Beach, they knew based on the fact that they didn't want them in their neighborhood that they were retaliated against because they tried to get them out of their neighborhood. So they knew that the group was dangerous, you know, given what they went through, the firebombing of their homes. And then there were allegations of criminal activities that some in the community believed to be true. I mean, they had relatives who joined the group, and I'm sure that their relatives, some of them would have indicated their disenchantment with the group, given the fact that they were able to determine that what Mitchell was preaching was not reality. So that you had the two dynamics. But you're right. I mean, you know, developing witnesses and getting enough information to charge, enough evidence to charge these individuals was not easy. And that's why I said it took dedication to duty. I mean, even as you know, as a former FBI agent, some people within the FBI didn't believe in the case. And so I, at times, had to go above and beyond the call of duty, because I had the Yahweh case with a number of sub-files, and then I had one supervisor that was trying me several other cases. That's why I just had to work long hours, because I had to keep up with all my cases, including the major investigation. And, you know, it was difficult on my family as well, being away and so on. So, but I'm glad I did what I did, when I did it, and how I did it, because we were able to finally charge 15 individuals, including Yahweh Ben Yahweh. We were able to indict them. Federal grand jury indictment that came down, that was returned. And then after the indictments, we had to prepare for the arrest, which was another major undertaking by the Bureau. It was called Operation Jericho. And we had arrest teams in a number of cities throughout the United States. Everything was managed out of Miami Fan Post, but the main arrest, everything was contingent upon us arresting Hulon Mitchell, who was on his, what they called, country tour. And they were in New Orleans at the time, and so I was sent to New Orleans by the SAC from Miami. And I hold him in high regards, because he trusted me. He trusted me to know the ins and outs of this group. He was able to, and I have, like I said, a lot of respect for him. His name is Bill Gavin. He was the SAC in Miami at the time. So I was sent to New Orleans to assist the SAC in New Orleans and the group with the arrest. We knew that they were staying at the Montleone Hotel in French Quarters. The arrest was extremely successful. My input to the SAC, I believe, was also well received. And based on that, we were able to arrest Mitchell without incident. And after his arrest, there was a busload of Yahweh members who left the Montleone Hotel on the way to Houston, and we were able to stop, the Bureau was able to stop that bus and arrest, I believe, one or two of the people indicted was on the bus. The operation in Miami, with several people were arrested at the temple. So overall, it was a great success, not only for the Bureau, but for law enforcement in general, the local partners. I'm very pleased with the partnership with local law enforcement.
How many people were actually followers of the Yahweh Temple?
That's a good question. We estimated that there were approximately 5,000.
And this is not just in the Miami-Dade area, but also throughout different areas of the United States. Where else were they located?
They had temples in Philadelphia, New York, if I remember correctly, New York. They were in 13 cities throughout the United States, Atlanta. So yeah, they were expanding. What he would do is indoctrinate people and then send them to different cities to be his representative, and instructed them to do basically what he did by recruiting followers.
And he thought he was the Son of God. He thought he was the Messiah.
Yeah, he started out as being Hulon Mitchell. Then he said he all of a sudden became Yahweh Ben Yahweh, God, Son of God. He's the Messiah. He was sent to save, black people and to uncover the real, true Israelites. The man was a con man. That's what one of the prosecutors said that, and I believe that to be the case as well. He was a very charismatic speaker, and so he was able to convince a lot of his followers. But once he claimed to be the Messiah, that's when some of the people decided, look, this is not for me. I want out. Of course, they could not say that openly, because they saw what happened to Ashton Green.
And he was the guy that got beat up and decapitated and thrown into the Everglades.
Yeah, Everglades, right? Yes. When his body was found in the Everglades, body was in one location and his head was severed, so his head was found at another location. That crime scene was horrific. That occurred in 1981.
As is the case in a number of these religious cults that we hear about, the leader, once he starts gathering more and more followers, seems to become, in his own mind, more godlike. What were some of the things that he began to take power over as far as his followers were concerned? Did he get to a point where he was setting up rules and strict guidelines for them to follow?
Absolutely. Strict control. He determines what they eat, when they eat, and who. They had what they called the room of understanding, which is a punishment room. And those who are placed in the room of understanding had to kneel for hours and hours without food or water. Robert Rozier was one of those who were placed in the room of understanding. And Robert Rozier was a former football player. He was about 6'3", about 230, 40 pounds. Can you imagine somebody that big being subjected to that type of punishment and accepting it?
How much of his cooperation led to the success of your investigation?
Well, I think it was a great deal because he was a part of the Death Angels, so he knew about the murders. He knew about the group within the group, the planning of some of the criminal activities, what the results were as far as Mitchell's reaction once these activities were carried out. But of course, he was involved in several of the murders that he confessed to, and worked a deal with the state attorney's office where he, based on his cooperation, he received 22 years in prison.
Let's talk a little bit more about the indictment that you mentioned that was filed before the arrest could be made. Now, it's my understanding a lot of these charges were for racketeering. Could you explain to everyone why they did not list specifically all the murders?
Well, the murders were a part of the charges were Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organization Act. That's the RICO statute. And the predicates were murder, attempted murder, arson, and extortion. Of course, there was a conspiracy part of that as well, which eventually was what they were convicted of. The murders were a part of the predicates for the charges.
My understanding that at the time there was no federal homicide charge, and so these murders were listed basically as racketeering activities.
Yeah, correct. That's right. Obviously, in addition to the federal charges, the state could and did charge some of them with the murders.
How many individuals ended up being charged and how many ended up being convicted?
Okay, the indictment charged 15 individuals, including Hulon Mitchell, his wife, Linda Gaines, and 13 others. Of those, 7 were convicted. Now, the case was really pretty complicated, and we had a judge who has since passed away that was, shall I say, pretty interesting. That's all I'm going to say about that. But during the trial, we had to have escorts for the prosecutors to and from their location where they resided, a temporary residence. We had agents escorting them to and from. In addition to that, of course, I had to take appropriate precautions regarding my own safety. One thing that occurred, one of the prosecutor's secretary, who was assisting with the trial, she lived in Miami. She was on her way home, and she was murdered. I have my own thoughts about that particular situation, but I did get a call from the FBI wanting to know if I wanted to be transferred, of course, with my family, and I said no. I wanted to complete the investigation, and I happen to be a former SWAT team trained member with the FBI, so I knew how to protect myself and take the necessary measures to protect my family and do what was necessary to get the job done.
The secretary, was it the belief that her murder was related to the investigation of the Yahweh Temple?
The way I'll answer that question is that there were some people arrested for that murder, but as far as I know, there was no known link. At least that's what we were told. I have my personal belief about that, but that's another, I don't want to say any more than that.
Okay. Well, I do have follow-up questions. For instance, the Yahweh Temple, are they extinct or do they still exist to this day?
Yeah, they still exist to this day, but by the way, he ended up dying a few years back. He was released a year before his sentence. He got 18, he was sentenced to 18 years in prison. And about a year before the 18th year, because he was diagnosed with cancer and they knew that he was going to pass, they were able to convince the system to release him, and then he subsequently passed away. But they're still around, and that's all I'm going to say about that at this point.
Well, I think for most people listening, you've just given us a little bit of a shock to say that Yahweh Ben Yahweh only received 18 years because one of the people that he directed to do the murders got 22 years, and here he is directing others to commit the total of 14 murders, and he only gets 18 years. What's the deal with that?
Well, obviously, I was disappointed. The judge chose, he was convicted on the conspiracy charges, and the maximum was 20 years in prison. And the judge chose to sentence him to 18 years. The case was so complicated and some of the issues that came up, convincing the jury. The case ended up in a hung jury, some of the charges, and the conviction was the conspiracy charge. The department chose not to retry the other folks because some of them were going to be charged with murder by the state. This was, let me tell you, it was a difficult case, and given all the twists and turns about the case, boy, it was a pretty interesting situation. As a matter of fact, the Opelika cases, the attorney that was involved in the Opelika case, I ended up assisting. The Opelika case was a civil case, and that case was going to be going before the criminal case. And so I was able to get the Bureau to allow me to assist the attorney in the Opelika case because of the potential danger and all the other stuff that we've talked about. And I was able to do that. There's so many different areas of this case that it's been amazing. It's one of the more successful domestic terrorism cases that the Bureau have conducted. And so for that, I'm very pleased and proud of. But boy, it took quite a bit of effort in understanding the system and dealing with witnesses. I remember going to visit Ashton Green's mom and talking to her about her son.
He was the one that was beat up
beheaded.
He was the one that was beheaded. Okay.
Yes, that was one of the most difficult things that I've done as an agent. When you go through those types of things, those things are motivating factors to know that you need, despite the obstacles, to do a good job so that these people can be brought to justice, and we accomplished that.
The Opelika case that you mentioned assisting, that was the arson case where after they tried to kick them out of the neighborhood, they came back and firebombed.
No, that the arson case was in Delray Beach. The Opelika case was the case where the Yahwehs purchased a number of buildings in Opelika, Florida, and they attempted to evict some of the tenants that were living at those apartments, and individuals that were murdered in that instance were Anthony Brown and Rudy Broussard. Those were tenants of the apartment. Anthony Brown was the one who on TV said that he wasn't moving and so forth.
That was just strange because you mentioned that it was a civil case. And
well, yes, the attorney, maybe I wasn't clear. Those individuals ended up getting, or their relatives, in addition to other tenants, ended up getting an attorney to file a civil case regarding that particular situation against the Yahwehs. And of course, I assisted the attorney, the civil attorney, the attorney who worked on the civil case on behalf of the tenants and the victims.
Well, just from our conversation, I can see that you definitely have enough with this case to write a book. And I think that, listeners who would be interested in learning more, especially some of those behind-the-scenes details, going to be waiting to hear, when your book is going to be released. So make sure you let me know.
Oh, absolutely. But it's interesting because in addition to that particular case, I was the on-scene commander on the James Byrd case in Jasper, Texas. He was a black individual who lived in Jasper, and he was kidnapped by two white supremacists and then tied up with a chain, and he was dragged throughout the street and dismembered. His body was dismembered. There is a James Byrd, and I don't remember the name of the other individual, but there's a civil rights statute that was enacted based on that case. So that's kind of an interesting situation. If you Google Jasper, Texas, and James Byrd, you'll come up with that information. It was quite an experience. I was the assistant agent in charge in the Houston Division at the time. I've had an interesting career with the Bureau. So my dilemma is, how much do I put in a book? And I may have to write 2 books.
It certainly is. This was fascinating listening to you review this case. But I'd like to take a little bit of time to learn a little bit more about you. When did you join the FBI, and why did you join the FBI?
Well, that's an interesting story. I was born and raised in Panama, in the Canal Zone. My dad worked for 40 years for the U.S. government, and my grandfather and grandmother were from Jamaica, and they moved to Panama to help build the canal.
How old were you when you moved to the U.S. from Panama, and are you a native Spanish speaker? Yes,
I'm a native Spanish speaker, and I went to school in Nebraska, Doane College. I'm a former athlete. I played basketball for Doane. By the way, I was also a member of the Panamanian national team. They call it the Panamanian Olympic team. My degree was in psychology, Spanish, and education from Doane College. And then I became a school teacher, a coach, and then went back to school, University of Nebraska at Omaha, and got a master's degree in education administration. Became an administrator, and I decided, you know what, it's time to become an FBI agent. I always wanted to be, or was always interested in becoming some kind of law enforcement individual since I was a kid. My cousin was an FBI agent, and we talked, and, you know, I just decided I'm going to leave my very productive career as a school administrator and become an FBI agent. So I took a pay cut, and then, of course, after passing the exams and all that, I had to go to Quantico, and going through the academy was pretty simple for me, except for the fact that I had never fired a weapon before going to the academy, so I did not have any bad habits about shooting when I went to the academy, and I learned from the firearms instructors the right way to fire a weapon and so forth. And of course, we have the 3 areas at the academy: firearms, you have academics, and then you also have physical fitness. So academics and physical fitness, I knew would be pretty easy for me. The only issue was firearms, and so I worked at it and became proficient in firearms to the point where, as I mentioned, I became a SWAT team member. I was one of the people involved in security for the 1984 Olympics as a SWAT team member from the San Diego Division. So you retired several years ago. What are you doing now? I own my own company, Cousins and Associate. I do consulting in law enforcement, litigation support. I work with law firms involved in civil litigation. And, of course, I have the material to write my book. It's going to be a fascinating book. You've got a lot of great stories. I'm also, by the way, a member of the Screen Actors Guild. I've done commercials. In fact, I was Magic Johnson's double in a healthcare commercial. That's interesting. Yeah, I've also done some work with Shaquille O'Neal, and Charles Barkley, the old T-Mobile commercials. I was Charles Double in those. And Dwayne Wade, by the way, as well, was involved in the commercial. When I retired, I was the agent in charge of one of the field offices, and I went to work as the Inspector General for the Miami-Dade County Public Schools. I did that for 2 years. I like to give my guests the last word. You could talk about the case that we reviewed or your career, but the last word is yours. What would you like to say? I hope that I was able to convey to your listeners that being an FBI agent is an honor. we serve this country. And signing up to become an FBI agent to me was so interesting and honorable that I did the best I could in order to protect this country. And I believe that the majority of my former and current colleagues are doing the same. The agents sign up, they recognize and accept the risk, the potential danger, and we just go about doing our jobs. Despite the obstacles that we encounter along the way, we find a way to overcome those and to get the job done.
And that's the end of the interview. Back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Herb Cousins, a photo of Yahweh Ben Yahweh, that link to the FBI Files episode, Temple of Fear, and numerous newspaper articles about Yahweh Ben Yahweh and his Nation of Yahweh. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You'll find social media share buttons at the bottom of this episode's show notes, and of course, you can share it directly from your device. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast app, so that every Thursday morning a new episode will appear on your device. I know I promised that I would be talking about the third book in Robert Dugoni's Tracy Crosswhite series, but I haven't been able to finish it yet. I've been busy working with my editor on my soon-to-be-released FBI crime novel, Greedy Givers. But if you're looking for a good crime novel to read, I hope you'll check out my FBI thriller, Pay to Play, about a female FBI agent investigating corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry. It's available at Amazon.com as an ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.